Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Well, this morning we have the familiar and sort of quirky story of Bartimaeus, the healing of Bartimaeus. And the reason I say it's quirky, it's got some really kind of unusual details in it. One of them is the fact that Jesus asked this blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, I can see his disciples going, what a silly question. But I think it's a really good question, actually, that Jesus is asking this blind man, what is it that he truly wants? And he asks it in a way, Bartimaeus could have said anything. Bartimaeus could have said, "I want my child healed," or something like that. It could have been something different than wanting to see again. So I think Jesus asked that question as really a good example for all of us to be asking good questions, and then also to be thinking about the things that the questions are coming about, because it might not be as obvious as we think. It's important, I think, for us to ask ourselves, as Jesus asks us, "What do you want me to do for you?" Because when we begin to look at the questions, when we get deeper into some of the things that are happening in our lives, and what is it really that we want? Can we really ask ourselves that question and go deeper than what might be the obvious things? And in asking the question, Jesus also gives Bartimaeus the opportunity to choose something. To choose something. Now, if Jesus had just walked up to him and healed his sight, Bartimaeus, that would have been wonderful, but he might not have chosen that. Of course, he probably would, but he might not have. Jesus gives us a chance to choose what it is that we want Jesus to do for us. Now, asking good questions is an art. If you're in the spiritual discovery group, this will be familiar to. We work on questions all the time. And we've been learning about how to ask questions that are open and honest, that are real questions, and questions that are there for the sake of the one who receives the question, not necessarily for us. Sometimes we ask questions for ourselves because we want more information, or, and that's perfectly fine. We need to have details about this or that or whatever, or we're curious or whatever it might be. So we can ask questions for ourselves, but we can also ask questions for somebody else. Ask questions as Jesus did for Bartimaeus. Ask questions that will help the other person come to a choice and a realization or whatever might be needed. So Jesus' question, "What do you want me to do for you?" This is really an open question. And the answer could have been just about anything. It could have been surprising and unexpected. And one thing about asking that question, that kind of question, is that you let the responder have the opportunity to make a response, and it can be anything, and there's no sort of expectation. So some of these open questions might be, where do you think your path will lead you? That answer could could be all kinds of different things. Or something like, what are you hoping to accomplish? Or what kind of help do you need? Those are all open questions that could have responses of all different kinds. The answers could go anywhere. And those questions feel good to us. They're an invitation to open and to share. Now there's other kinds of questions that are advice or fixing or judgment or suggestions. See how these feel to you. Do you think you need to see a therapist? Have you tried dieting? Can you do a better job of controlling your emotions? Now, when we get questions like that, they feel different, don't they? You can feel that they have some judgment or advice or a suggestion. And those are not really questions. They're not really open. They have an expectation that you will sort of comply. Questions are not about fixing. They're not about fixing or advice or suggestions or judgment. And we can feel the difference viscerally when we have those kinds of questions. Those kinds of questions have an agenda that's pretty easy for us to see. When we ask a question that's open and honest, it needs to be a real question. So here are some good and some maybe not so open and honest questions. And the questioner doesn't need to be invested in the response. So here's one that is invested. Doesn't that make you angry? And the response should be, yeah, it makes me angry. Or how about here's one that's open and honest. How do you feel about that? Gets at the same thing, but it's not a suggestion or advice. How about this one? Do you think this is unfair? It's like you should think it's unfair if you don't. Or what do you think is going on in this situation? A more open, honest question. Do you think or do you wish things would be different? That's another sort of suggestion. Whereas, what would an ideal conclusion look like? So two different kinds of questions: suggestions, advice, or fixing, or open and honest questions that are invitations to go deeper. And the responses to an open, honest question could be anything. What if Bartimaeus had said to Jesus, I want to fly? That's an open, honest question with a very surprising answer, but an invitation into something totally different. Something where there could be a conversation and some exploration and some imagination and thinking and reflecting on how things could be or what could happen. So a whole different conversation would have resulted with Bartimaeus. And what I trust is that whatever happened, Bartimaeus would have gotten just what he needed. Probably not to fly, but just what he needed. An open, honest question encourages the responder to use his or her imagination, to think outside the box, to see things from a fresh point of view. An open, honest question opens up our thinking and moves us out of a stuck place. So Jesus asks the open, honest question, and then Bartimaeus responds adamantly, surprisingly. He leads the way to his own healing and vision. He says, I want to see again. Now, so we know Bartimaeus at some point in his life had vision. And so he wants to see again. He knew that he needed that physical healing. And what he got was so much more. He received a spiritual healing as well. And we read that after he got his sight back, he jumped up. Well, he had jumped up before that and followed Jesus. So he became enlightened and had a deeper relationship with God. You know, Jesus asks all of us that very same question. What do you want me to do for you? And we can be like Bartimaeus and follow in the footsteps of Jesus and be aware of our own blindness and have our eyes opened and see again, we can see with all of ourselves. And Jesus asks us and offers to help us to see, to give us insight and vision and enlightenment, foresight and clarity, to have some deep self-awareness just in answering the question. We grow in our self-awareness. We see ourselves clearly. And in answering an open, honest question, we have a new beginning of some sort. We know ourselves in a new way, and something happens, something changes. The door is open. When we begin to see ourselves clearly, we are often called to a change, a self-awareness that leads us to something new, to spiritual health, wholeness, and holiness. And we can see with all of ourselves, we can engage the world. We can see with all of our senses, with our intuition and our spirit. We can see with a new clarity and depth and truth when we look at the world and ourselves and God with all of who we are. We can see things that are holy that we might not have seen before. We can see the presence of Christ. Our hearts are made tender when we see the world and ourselves and God in the fullest possible way. So our vision, of course, is more than just seeing. And sometimes it's hard work to look and see and envision clearly. We can see with our hearts. And as I said last time about discernment, we can see with the eyes of God. So when we're in a discernment process, asking the right questions is really important. It's key to having successful discernment. And when we ask the right questions, we need to ask them in the right way, openly and honestly. So when a community such as Grace Church is in a discernment process, asking open, honest questions and thinking about what those questions are is critical to the whole process. We can ask Jesus to help us to see. We can ask Jesus to help us to ask those open, honest questions that will give us insight and vision, enlightenment, and foresight. We can ask those questions that will help us as a congregation to grow in self-awareness, to see who we are clearly so that we know where we are going in our discernment process. We can take those open, honest questions and see them as a beginning, a new start, a new way of knowing who we are and growing in Christ. And when we begin to see ourselves as a community clearly, we will find that we are called to change, to self-awareness that leads us to something new, to spiritual health, wholeness, and holiness. So as a congregation, let us see with all of ourselves. Let us engage the world with all of ourselves, with each person individually and as a community, to see with all of our senses, with all of the intuition that we have as a congregation, with the Spirit of Christ. Let us see with a new clarity and depth and truth. If we ask those open, honest questions, we will go deeper into who we are. So right now, we need to see and hear and open our spiritual eyes and ears to see the holy things that are all around us, to have our hearts tendered and receptive to the presence of God. And then to be thankful for the vision that Jesus provides for us when he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" I want to have vision. I want to see truth and depth and love with spiritual eyes and spiritual ears. So a discernment process and all those good questions lead us to conversion, to change, to see with the eyes of God, and to respond to what we see. We are called to respond to a call as we are called to awareness, that something is new and different. And when we see Christ, we might see things that are missing. We might see things that are broken. We might see the things that were very obvious before. And we might recognize Jesus, the healer, the Messiah, the Son of David. Another interesting sort of detail in this Bartimaeus passage is that when Jesus calls Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus jumps up and throws off his cloak and goes to Jesus. Now, I think there's really a few things that are unusual about that. One is most blind people, my father's blind, they wouldn't jump up like that. They're pretty cautious really when they move most of the time. Careful. So jumping up, first of all, is interesting, but also what Bartimaeus was doing, his cloak was would receive the coins as he was begging. So this was kind of like his coin holder. And I'm sure when he threw that cloak off, they went all over the place. So Bartimaeus, in a way, was getting rid of some of the things that he didn't need. Did he need to see, or did he need the coins? It was really clear to him. This is what I need here, is Jesus and the healing that he brings. And these coins are nothing compared to that. So in that moment, there was a great conversion for Bartimaeus. In that moment of seeing, he was letting go of death and embracing new life. For Bartimaeus, this was the beginning of discipleship, the beginning of following Jesus where Jesus would lead him. Bartimaeus recognized Jesus. The one man who was blind is the one who saw Jesus most fully for who he was. Bartimaeus knew who he was, he believed, and he was healed. His faith made him well. So if we are wise, we will follow in the footsteps of Bartimaeus, who followed in the footsteps of Christ, as individuals, as community, as a congregation. Bartimaeus had to fight for it. Others ordered him to be quiet, to give up, and he persisted. He cried out for Jesus even more loudly. He recognized Jesus, and he knew who he was. He saw God before him, and he was healed, made whole, and followed Christ. So we are all like the blind man in one way or another, or maybe in many ways. Both as individuals, as a community, we need to be healed, to open our eyes to see God. And if we have the wisdom to ask for our sight from the one who is the light, to work hard at seeing with the eyes of God, to see all of who we are, then we also will be made well. Amen.